My name is Timothy Terrell. I teach economics at Wofford College in Spartanburg, South Carolina. Some of you might have heard of Wofford because we made it to the NCAA tournament, basketball tournament, this past spring. And we're the smallest school ever to make it to the big dance. So we're 1,400 students or so, and we're really happy about that. So we're going to brag about that for the next 10 years. I'm here to talk about markets and the environment, and it's a topic that I think is of considerable importance for us who are interested in free markets because it presents some problems that I don't think are unsolvable, but they're something that we do need to wrestle with. And I want to start out with a little story here, and we'll go from here. When I was doing my dissertation here at Auburn a long time ago, my students keep getting younger and younger. I stay the same age, but I did some work on environmental regulation, and one of the things I found was there was this interesting story involving disposal of toxic waste. And I thought I'd start off with that because I think it illustrates some of the problems that we face. In the 1980s, there was a law passed that required certain toxic waste to be disposed of by incineration. And because of this, a number of an entire industry really sprung up to satisfy the requirements of this regulation, the incinerator industry. And basically what they would do is they would take usually flammable toxic waste, paint thinners, and petroleum derivatives, and they would heat these at several thousand degrees Fahrenheit or something and turn the toxic waste into some sort of relatively harmless ash. Well then, a few years into this, after this industry had grown up and had begun making a lot of money, charging somewhere around $300 per ton to dispose of this stuff, cement kilns discovered that they could do the same kind of thing. After all, they had ovens, kilns to heat the limestone and whatever the other ingredients were for cement. And they thought, well, all we got to do is run a little pipe, and you can see one of those here in this plant, the yellow-looking pipe on the left-hand picture there. And they could put this into their kiln, which was already the required temperature, and do the same thing that the incinerators were doing, except they could do it for about a third the price. So the incinerators began to lose business to the cement kilns. And so what did they do? They lobbied, but they didn't directly lobby. They didn't go to the congressman and they didn't say, well, we don't like the cement kilns competing with us. Make a law that says they can't compete. That's too obvious. Voters might eventually figure this out, and this is not pleasant for the politician to have to explain why he's trying to destroy competition. So the incinerators began to, under the table, fund these so-called grassroots organizations, one called the Pennsylvania Environmental Enforcement Project. And what they would do is they would, supposedly this group of concerned citizens being funded by these large incinerator companies, would then sue the cement kilns for burning toxic waste. And they would make these claims that they weren't doing so safely enough and so forth. Well, they were able to do this kind of thing because environmental regulation has become statutory in nature. You don't have to show necessarily that you were harmed by somebody's activity to bring a lawsuit against a company under most of our environmental regulations. The law of standing has changed. In fact, the regulatory law has written into it, in most cases, a provision that says if you see that a regulation has been violated, you don't have to be personally harmed, you can bring a lawsuit. Now, the regulation might be something like, you didn't follow the reporting requirements, you didn't tell the local citizens what it was that you have in your factory that might be toxic. You didn't provide this documentation. Nobody had to be harmed. It's just that the rule had to be violated. Now, what is the Austrian approach to this? How do we deal with environmental problems? Oh, I should mention this. This is the Sierra Club. I believe he was either the legal counsel or the president at one point. I'm trying to remember his title, but fairly high up in the Sierra Club. It says the commercial waste industry, that is the incinerator industry, has an interest in improving regulations sufficiently to drive mom-and-pop operations out of business. And by mom-and-pop, he meant cement kilns, for whom only a fraction of their business was burning toxic waste. Most of it was making cement. Okay, so how do Austrians think about this? One of the most important articles that you will find on environmental issues from an Austrian perspective is Law, Property Rights, and Air Pollution by Murray Rothbard. And this is an older article by now, but it's very, very good. And if you have an opportunity to read this, I would suggest it. It's a bit lengthy as journal articles go, but certainly Ronald Coase's 44-page article got plenty of attention and is well read, and I think that Rothbard's has been, unfortunately, neglected in comparison. And I think that you should try to find the time to read this. And I'm going to refer to this frequently in this talk. Now, basically, the Austrian approach goes back to tort law, which says that if someone aggresses against another individual by invading their property or affecting their person with pollution, they can be held strictly liable in a court and required to stop, or the legal term is enjoined. All right? Now, a harm generally is understood as a physical invasion of your person or property. And this would include, as we'll see, a lot of pollution problems. Little particles of something from somebody else float over into airspace that you are living in or working in, and therefore you might be affected negatively by this. So the Austrian approach requires a specific harm. It has to be something that is near and imminent, and you have to be the one who is damaged in order for you to bring a tort suit. All right. There we go. All right. Now this fellow here is Ronald Coase. I heard Professor Coase some years ago giving a speech at Clemson University. He's, last I heard, his paper on externalities was one of the most cited, maybe the most cited paper in the field of economics. Of course, he won the Nobel Prize some years ago as well. And his theorem that he's known for says that in the absence of transaction costs, the outcome, that is the amount of pollution that we wind up with, will be the same regardless of the initial assignment of the property rights by the courts. But whatever the courts decide, whether they give the property rights to person A or person B, the outcome would end up being the same. Now, we know that in fact transaction costs aren't zero. So, in those cases, which would be fairly frequent, I would say nearly always, you would have to have the court balance the costs and the benefits and come up with some kind of determination as to who should have the rights. Now, here's Harold Demsetz, well known as a prominent Coasean, and if you get a chance, another exchange that you might find well worth reading occurred in the Review of Austrian Economics some years ago between Walter Block and Harold Demsetz, and you might find some of it entertaining as well as educational. I, of course, believe Block got the better end of that debate. It was an interesting little exchange on Austrian pure snow trees and various other things to bring out these kinds of points that the Austrians are making. The problem for the Coaseans, I think, is the subjectivity of costs and benefits. In many cases, you can't say, and in fact, in any case, not in many cases, but in any case, you cannot say truly what the costs and the benefits really are. Now, adapting a famous example from Coase's paper. Suppose you have a railroad, old-style railroad, coal-burning, throwing out sparks from the smokestack, and it's riding along the track through an orchard. And the sparks that fly off of the train occasionally will set fire to the grass near the track and maybe burn out the orchard. So let's suppose that the railroad, in throwing off these sparks, would commit $100,000 worth of damage, market value, to the orchard. And then this is brought to court. Let's also suppose that the railroad can install a device on their locomotive that will prevent the sparks from flying off and burning the orchard. And that this device costs $80,000. What does Coase say? Well, Coase says it doesn't matter whether you assign the rights to the farmer or the rights to the railroad in terms of what you eventually get. So Rothbard discusses this in his Law of Property Rights and Air Pollution that I've mentioned. He says, let's suppose case one, farmer gets the rights. Court says, you have a right not to be burned out by the railroad. The railroad has to stop emitting sparks, and therefore you can make the railroad stop running trains or do something else to stop the sparks. Well, what the railroad would then be faced with is a choice between paying $80,000 to put the device on their tracks or paying the farmer $100,000 to compensate for the damage. So the end result is the railroad puts $80,000 piece of equipment on their locomotive. Problem is solved. In case number two, Rothbard says, is suppose the railroad gets the rights and the farmer is told, I'm sorry, the railroad has the right to run their trains along their track and emit sparks and you can't make them stop. So the farmer then has to suffer this $100,000 loss or give $80,000 to the railroad to compensate the railroad for putting this device on their locomotives. And presumably at some price between $80,000 and $100,000, the farmer would be able to entice the railroad to install this device. And again, the device is installed. That's the final result. Now, some problems with this. A lot of problems with this, actually. First, income and wealth, as Rothbard says, are important to the parties involved, even though they might not be important to uninvolved economists. It makes a great deal of difference to them who has to pay whom. Secondly, and I think this is more critical and fundamental, this thesis works only if we deliberately ignore psychological factors. Costs are not just monetary. I mean, suppose the farmer has this attachment to the orchard that's far beyond the monetary damage. Maybe this is an orchard that belonged to the farmer's great-great-great-great-grandmother, and this has some sentimental value as well as whatever market value the orchard might have from producing apples or oranges or whatever it's producing. So the orchard to the farmer might be worth $1 million, not $100,000. In fact, I think it's safe to say that for most of us, our property is worth more to us than it would be on the open market. Otherwise, everyone would be trying to sell their house. I don't want to sell my house. I like my house. In fact, the value of my house is greater than it would be to the rest of the market. If that ever changed and the value of my house became less than the value to the market, guess what? There'd be a for sale sign in my yard. So we can expect this psychological value to frequently put the total value to the farmer over the value to the market. So now this completely undermines the Coasean argument that the courts can make this sort of decision and that the decision won't make any difference as to the outcome. If the farmer is awarded the rights, then the farmer will avoid the $100,000 in damage, and the railroad will not be able to compensate the farmer enough to allow the railroad to put on this device. In the second case, where there's not likely to be a way for the farmer to raise $1 million to stop the smoke invasion of the orchard. So it does matter. The farmer would not be satisfied with anything less than the preservation of the orchard. So a key problem here is the subjectivity of value and cost. So, Coase and Dempsey would say all transaction costs are zero, or let's assume that they are for our purposes. Well, if they're not, and they acknowledge that's likely to be the case, they would say, let's allocate the property rights to whichever route entails the minimum social transaction costs. Now, once we understand that costs are subjective to each individual, and therefore we can't measure them, then we can't add up the costs, and we can't come up with anything like a social transaction cost. This is impossible. So we can't compare costs in case 1 or case 2 or anything else. This completely breaks down. Now, another more philosophical problem, I think, with the Coase-Dempsey approach is that they pretend to be value-free here, but they're not. They're trying to say, well, we're after efficiency. Okay, why should efficiency trump liberty and property rights? Furthermore, efficiency implies a goal. Efficient to what end? If you think of a car as efficient, what does that bring up in your mind? Well, saves gas, maybe. But that's not the only way in which a car can be efficient. Maybe it's efficient at towing a boat, in which case it probably wouldn't be very fuel efficient, but it might be efficient at towing a boat. Maybe it's efficient in terms of the use of the materials to manufacture it. Cars might be very expensive to manufacture because they have to achieve some sort of low usage of gasoline. Hybrids tend to be more expensive vehicles for that reason. Is that efficient in terms of the use of resources to manufacture? Well, maybe not. So you have to decide what the goal is before you can decide whether something's efficient or not. So what is the goal? Is the goal lower dollar costs? Is the goal to prevent orchards from being burned out? Is the goal liberty, preservation of human rights to their property, or the efficient use of some other resource? It can't be value-free here. Rothbard wrote a chapter in Mario Rizzo's book, Time, Uncertainty, and Disequilibrium, in which he said, we cannot decide on public policy, tort law, rights, or liabilities on the basis of efficiencies or minimizing of costs. He says only ethical principles can serve as criteria for our decisions. Efficiency, he says, can never serve as the basis for ethics. On the contrary, he says, ethics must be the guide and touchstone for any consideration of efficiency. And he goes on to say that we as economists have to get used to this idea that we can't explain everything with our discipline. Our discipline is limited. We have to remember that ethical considerations are outside of our economic considerations. And we have to have some sort of basis for those ethics, and Rothbard has written extensively on this as well, ethics of liberty and that kind of thing. You can read plenty on what he's written on ethics. But he's not saying that you can decide everything on the basis of what's efficient. Now, so, Coase has problems. What would Rothbard recommend instead? Skip over some of this wonderful material here so we can get moving. Okay. Rothbard would have people homestead unclaimed property. And this would include homesteading not only parcels of land, so the traditional sense of homesteading that you might think of is you find an unclaimed piece of property, nobody's living there, nobody seems to have any claim to it, and you move onto this property, you build a house, you clear the land, you start plowing the ground or grazing your cattle or whatever, and you've mixed your labor with the land. So now this becomes yours by right, ethically, Rothbard would say. It's yours. And what he's doing in this article is extending this idea of homesteading beyond plowing a parcel of land to homesteading a certain amount of environmental cleanliness or using the environment for some specific purpose. You can use air to breathe. You can also use air to dump certain things into the atmosphere. We're all exuding the waste products of our breathing process as we're sitting here. Air conditioning in this building, which I'm very happy about right now, is dumping heat into the surrounding environment. I don't see a problem with that. But there are some cases in which dumping something into the environment might impose some costs on someone else. So Rothbard's saying no action should be considered illicit or illegal unless it invades or aggresses against the person or the justly owned property of another. Only invasive actions should be considered illegal and combated, he says, with the full power of the law. And that has to be a concrete and physical invasion. Now, what's a physical invasion? Well, let me give you an example of what it's not. You have the right to the physical integrity of your property. You do not have the right to the value of your property. The value of your property on the market is determined by the thoughts, the beliefs, the values of others, which do not belong to you. You don't own someone else's valuation of your property. So let's look at one common example of something people bring up when they really hate the market and want to find some way to argue against it. Walmart, sort of the lightning rod for all of the anti-market thinking. Everything people despise about markets is supposedly being committed by Walmart. Walmart, I hear this from students all the time. Well, Walmart's terrible because they come into an area and they build this big box on the bypass, and they all the little mom and pop stores that we like to look at, they go out of business. And so it's not right that Walmart should come into existence in our neighborhood. I had one Walmart built near my house. I'm very happy about that because it makes my trip to Walmart shorter. And I like to poke fun at people who live in a very expensive neighborhood not far from that Walmart. The neighborhood's Thornblade. And so I call it the Thornblade Walmart. It just irks them to no end. Apparently they did something with the legally in granting Walmart consent to build on this property. They had Walmart agree to make their sign on the road very, very small. So you almost can't find the Walmart unless you know where it is already. There's a little tiny little sign, not much bigger than that screen there. And this is a gigantic Walmart, kind of off the road a little bit, and it's hidden. Signs half hidden by a tree, and what's the beef with Walmart? Walmart has no right to their customers, but neither do the mom and pops. All the little mom and pop stores go out of business because their customers decided whatever Walmart has to offer is better than what the mom and pop had to offer. Walmart's not taking their customers because the customers didn't belong to the mom and pops in the first place. Now, there are plenty of reasons not to like Walmart. I saw an excellent article as a Mises Daily some time ago on reasons why it's legitimate not to like Walmart. Long lines, crowds, bacteria, whatever you don't like about crowds and fluorescent lighting and all the other things that people find distasteful about Walmart, you don't have to shop there. You can go to the mom and pop, and there are quite a few mom and pops that have found plenty of niche markets within which they can do quite well. But Walmart's committed no ethical wrong in Rothbard's system. Now, what constitutes an invasion to someone's property? Well, Rothbard spends a good bit of time on this reasonable man standard. What would a judge or a jury think was a reasonable apprehension of an imminent attack? And then what response are we permitted to commit against this invasion? Well, the reasonable man standard says, and I'll just quickly go through this example. Let's say you have Jones who assaults and attacks Smith. Smith pulls a gun and shoots at Jones but misses, and the shot goes wild and hits Brown, who's an innocent bystander. Should Smith be liable? Well, under a reasonable man standard, the courts would say Smith is not liable for hurting Brown because he was intending self-defense against Jones. But in libertarian theory and strict liability theory, Smith has in fact aggressed against Brown, although unintentionally, and he has to pay for this tort. Brown has a proper legal action against Smith. Smith also has an independent, separate, and proper action for assault and battery against Jones, who committed this attack that prompted the shot. And presumably, the liability or the penalty would be different in these two cases, and intent does seem to matter. But one of the great flaws, Rothbard says, in the orthodox negligence approach has been to focus on one victim's, that is Smith's, right to defend himself, or on his good faith mistake in accidentally hitting Brown, but it neglects this other person's rights. Now, suppose Brown, who got accidentally hit with a shot, could have seen Smith's finger tightening on the trigger and in a split second could have fired a shot that would have stopped Smith from shooting Brown. Would Brown have that right? And we would have to say, well, yes, sure. The plaintiff, Brown, does have the right to self-defense no less than Smith does. And if Smith were about to accidentally shoot Brown would have the right to self-defense. So, Rothbard says the strict liability theory, which focuses on everyone's right to self-defense, not just that of one person, has the predominance or should be favored, no matter how sincere, no matter how reasonable Smith's actions might have been. Now we can take this into the realm of property crimes. Anyone has the right to defend his property against an overt act initiated against it. And the victim, Rothbard says, should have the right to shoot the person who's trying to invade the property, no less than a person who's being assaulted. So, Rothbard does say now that we have to establish a strict causal connection. You can't just say, well, my air smells bad, and I see something coming from that smokestack over there, so that must be the reason my air smells bad, and I'm going to go sue them. You have to show who did the wrong, who did the invasion of your property, who aggressed against you by dumping their particles into your air. And then you have to be able to show that you're in fact damaged. All right. Now, back to the homesteading idea. What about an airport? I live near an airport. Not a very busy one, I'm glad to say, but there are airplanes that fly over my house and they create a good bit of noise. Do I have a right to sue the airport that's 3 miles from my house because of the air traffic that overflies my house? I mean, maybe I would even, let's think about this for a second, maybe since I own a quarter acre or so of land underneath my house, maybe I could say that my property rights extend up into the air, maybe even up into the atmosphere, into outer space. Could I then say that Hughes Satellite Company is aggressing against me because they put a satellite through my outer space property, and that upsets me that they're overflying my land? Or much less an airplane that's flying a few hundred feet over my property. Well, Rothbard would say, no, that's not the case. You can't say that you've been aggressed against because you didn't I didn't, as a homeowner, I did not homestead the outer atmosphere or even the land, or even the airspace a few hundred feet over my house. Now, if somebody decides they're going to barnstorm my house and they're going to, the shingles start flying off as they rip by in their jet airplane and clip a few leaves off my trees, that's a different matter. I have homesteaded that part of my airspace. What about the ground underneath? I was talking to a student about this earlier this week. One of you, it's amazing how fast you pick up on these kinds of things. But I was talking about this very concept with one of you, and the student mentioned what was the movie now? I'm trying to remember about the oil executive in California. There Will Be Blood. Thank you very much. He's in this kind of long-term battle with this fellow preacher that's refusing to cooperate with his attempts to buy oil leases for the land. And finally, the preacher gets desperate one day, and he comes to him and he says, "I'll sell you the oil leases." And the oil guy says, "Well, forget it. I've drunk your milkshake." He stuck the oil well down and went sideways, sucked out the oil from underneath the property. Not there anymore. Oil leases aren't worth much anymore. Rothbard would say, well, you weren't homesteading whatever's down deep underground underneath your property. You homesteaded the right to go play in your yard and keep your dog in the backyard and hang out your clothes to dry on the line or whatever you do in your yard, grow a garden. But you don't have the rights that extend infinitely down to the core of the earth and infinitely up into outer space somewhere in the middle of the Milky Way galaxy, because that's not something you've homesteaded. Now, suppose the airport near my house decides they're going to start hourly flights of some gargantuan airplane that makes an immense amount of noise, something like the Concorde, which is not flying anymore, but something that significantly increases the noise level. Well, they haven't homesteaded any noise creation whatsoever. They've only homesteaded the amount that they're currently using before I decided to move into my house. So they have earned an easement right to a certain decibel level, but they haven't earned an easement right to just any decibel level they choose. And Rothbard says this would apply equally well to air pollution. If I have a habit of lighting a bonfire in my backyard every other weekend or so, and I have my kids roast marshmallows in the backyard and so forth, then my neighbor can't decide after moving in that he's going to complain about my smoke from my bonfire in the backyard. I've homesteaded the right to continue, an easement right to continue to pollute the air with the smoke from my bonfire. Now, this is another area where the Coaseans would say, we don't care about homesteading rights. We just want minimum transaction costs, and then we'll let the parties negotiate after the court decision to come to some sort of technological solution that's efficient. So the Coaseans would look at cases very differently, I would say, than Rothbard does. One case that might be illustrative of this point is a 1932 case named Bove versus Donner Hanna Coke Company. This is Coke as in a coal derivative, not Coke as in beverage. The plaintiff had moved into an industrial region where the defendant, the Coke company, was operating a Coke oven on the opposite side of the street. And the plaintiff tried to take the Coke oven to court and say, well, they shouldn't have the ability to operate because they're creating a lot of noise and smoke and so forth that's influencing my ability to enjoy my property. And the Coke oven was there first. That matters to Rothbard. Does not matter to the Coasean type court necessarily. Or at least the court would be concerned more with the transaction costs than anything else, which I've already said you can't measure very well. So the court said, and Rothbard says this is perfectly appropriate. The court says, with all the dirt, smoke, and gas which necessarily come from factory chimneys, trains, and boats, and with full knowledge that this region was especially adapted for industrial rather than residential purposes and that factories would increase in the future, the plaintiff selected this locality as the site of her future home. She voluntarily moved into this district fully aware of the fact that the atmosphere would be constantly contaminated by dirt, gas, and foul odors, and that she could not hope to find in this locality the pure air of a strictly residential zone, and so forth. I won't read the rest, but they basically said she doesn't have a right to complain. She should have known that this was what was to be expected in this area at the time that she bought her property. Now, Rothbard goes on and he mentions this difference between trespass and nuisance. And he says, really, where you might say trespass is where you invade someone's property. You violate their exclusive possession of the property. Nuisance would be an interference with someone's use of the property, but not necessarily by invading it. So he's one legal scholar that Rothbard mentioned says this is the difference between chopping down a tree that falls across the boundary line onto my woodshed in the backyard, and that's trespass, or not necessarily demolishing the woodshed, even just chopping down the tree and having it fall in my yard would be trespass. Nuisance would be an interference with my enjoyment of the land by, say, operating some sort of noisy machinery next door. Well, what about something like radio waves? I suppose there might be some people that say, well, radio waves can change your genetic code or something like that. I don't know. I use my cell phone all the time, and I'm not worried about microwaving my brain, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. But I don't worry too much about all the gazillion radio waves that are passing through my body right now, and I don't consider that an aggression against me that they do. Boundary crossings, whether of your person through some sort of radio wave or crossings of your property boundaries, don't necessarily constitute a nuisance or aggression against you or a trespass. So Rothbard says the proper distinction between trespass and nuisance is really not based on exclusive possession, it's based on use and enjoyment. If I'm interfered with in terms of my use and enjoyment of my property, that's where there's a problem. But there should be proof of harm. I can't just go to a court and I can't just say, well, these radio waves are causing me emotional distress, that they're passing through my body. And that would not be given any credibility, and Rothbard says properly so, that would not happen. That should not happen. Now, let me summarize some of what we've done so far by giving you a little list here that very little list. I don't like long quotations. I'm sure you don't, but a little list here of the principles under which liability for an aggressor would exist. First of all, he says the polluter can't have established some sort of homestead easement. If the polluter has established that easement, there's no liability. Second, he says, while visible pollutants or noxious odors are per se aggression, in the case of invisible or insensible pollutants, something you can't feel or touch or taste or notice, the plaintiff has to prove actual harm. Third, the burden of proof of that aggression rests upon the plaintiff. Fourth, the plaintiff must prove strict causality from the actions of the defendant to the victimization of the plaintiff. More on that later. That's an important point. You have to show it's not just that I'm harmed, but that person or that firm did the harm. Fifth, you have to prove causality and aggression beyond a reasonable doubt. Not some sort of preponderance of the evidence, but beyond a reasonable doubt. Sixth, there's no vicarious liability. Now, we could say a lot about this, but I'm not going to say much today. There's only liability for those that commit the deed. So if I'm upset because my neighbor is mowing his grass at 3 o'clock in the morning and waking me up, I can sue my neighbor because he hasn't homesteaded the right to mow at 3 o'clock in the morning. Maybe 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but not in the morning. But I can't go sue the lawnmower manufacturer for not installing some sort of muffler on the lawnmower that prevents it from emitting noise. Because the lawnmower manufacturer didn't commit the deed. My neighbor did. No vicarious liability. District attorneys don't have any standing, Rothbard notes. They can't bring a lawsuit. Only the person who's harmed can bring a lawsuit. Now, one of the problems here is, what about multiple emitters of pollution? What if you've got a gazillion emitters and you don't know which one it is that's created the air pollution that you're suffering from? You live in LA or Guatemala City or Tokyo or someplace and you've got this allergies and your eyes are watering and you have lung problems or something because of all the pollution. Well, where's the pollution coming from? Well, 1 million car owners and drivers. Who do you sue? Do you have to file 1 million lawsuits? I mean, that's impractical. What do you do? Well, this goes back to one of those problems with generalized socialism. Statists will say, well, obviously this is something the market can't handle. Multiple emitters of pollution. We have to have a regulation. We have to require auto manufacturers to install this stuff on their cars to prevent pollution. This is using statism to solve a problem created by statism. I don't know why we blame capitalism for all of socialism's problems. One of the fundamental problems here is road ownership. It's government-owned roads. It'd be relatively easy to sue a road owner for this emission of carbon monoxide or particulates or whatever else is coming up out of the property of the road owner and floating over to somebody else's nose. But because we have road socialism, now we're trying to figure out how to go after 1 million different car owners instead. So I would say that multiple emitter problems are often the result of another pre-existing form of socialized property. There are some things that I'll just encourage you to read on your own time about class action lawsuits and that sort of thing, where you can sue as a group. If you have multiple plaintiffs, you can sue as a group, and that's often a problem with pollution as well. It's not just multiple emitters, it may be multiple recipients of the pollution. And Rothbard does not generally, well, not just generally, he does not agree with class action lawsuits where the victims who didn't even participate in the lawsuit are still bound by the results of the lawsuit. All right. Governments that try to regulate with statutory law or administrative declarations to try to resolve environmental problems are committing not only ethical problems, but they're also creating problems that create massive inefficiencies. Rothbard says these rules, administrative rules, command and control kind of regulation that governments promulgate, this is categorically wrong. He says any statute or administrative regulation necessarily makes actions illegal that are not overt initiations of crimes or torts according to libertarian theory. Every statute or administrative rule is therefore illegitimate and itself invasive and a criminal interference with the property rights of non-criminals. So, I'm required to put some sort of pollution control device on my ATV, maybe. What does that mean? Well, I'm kind of behind on my slides here. Let me catch up. Maybe I was planning to operate my ATV in an area where it's very remote and there's no initiation of any aggression against anybody else by my operation of my ATV. Noise from it, pollution from it, doesn't affect anybody, and so therefore I should not be subject to these kinds of rules that affect my the character of this piece of property. Now, I have a few minutes left. I wanted to spend a little bit of time on something of current interest, I think, and that's the BP oil spill. I think this helps us to understand some of these problems in maybe a more practical application. There's a Mises Daily article here that I'm quoting from last, I think, no, not last week, that's about a month ago last week, on the oil spill. And the author doesn't happen to be here, does he? Okay, well, I figure there's always a chance. All right. Well, Novak says that one of the reasons we had this problem with BP spilling these millions and millions and millions of gallons into the Gulf is that the government passed these rules. Again, these are administrative rules. Tort is not the basis for solving these environmental problems. It's administrative rules. Government passed these laws that gave the oil companies incentives to drill far offshore, that is, in deeper water where the risk is presumably higher. He says, in addition to the higher risk of accidents at that depth, the cost of solving any problems are necessarily greater in 5,000 feet of water than in, say, 250 feet of water. Now, there was something like a 5-fold increase in the amount of oil that oil companies could pump royalty-free in deep water as opposed to shallow water. And companies naturally responded to this incentive. From 1995 to 2003, Novak says there was something like a 250% increase in the percentage of oil coming from the deep water regions of the Gulf. So we're drilling where there's a risk of an accident to a greater extent. Let me show you something else here. This is a map that shows you all 4,000 or so of the offshore drilling platforms in the Gulf. What do you see? Looks to me like it's all in the northwestern Gulf area, and not in the eastern Gulf. Why is that?
Florida.
It's Florida, yeah. Why? So?
Different rules.
Different rules. The rule says you can't drill in the eastern Gulf. It looks like about the border between Alabama and Florida. So, what do you do if you're an oil company and you'd like to drill where the marginal cost is lower, and maybe that's in the eastern Gulf, but you can't do that because the rules say otherwise, so you have to go out into the deeper waters. So there's another incentive to drill deeper. Same kind of problems occurred during the Great Depression when agricultural regulations came along and they told farmers, we're going to give you incentives not to farm certain parts of your land. So what did farmers do? Well, they still wanted to produce crops and sell them, so they farmed the remaining portions of their land more intensively. And we got erosion problems. We got fertilizer runoff problems. And a lot of other environmental issues that occurred because the government had artificially restricted the boundaries of where they could farm. Same thing here. This is a little chart. I pulled this from the Novak piece, showing you the share of crude oil coming from depths greater than 200 meters. 26% in 1995, almost 70% by 2003. It's no wonder. You start drilling more at that depth, you're going to get problems. There are other factors. William Shugart, in an article literally last week, July 21st, mentions a tragedy of the commons problem. You can find this on the Independent Institute website, I believe. He says there were existing regulatory rules that assigned the ownership of crude oil deposits underneath the U.S. Outer Continental Shelf to the federal government. Those rights are auctioned off periodically by the Minerals Management Service. Now, you got bureaucratic administration of something valuable. oil rights. Do the bureaucrats in charge have an incentive to consider the alternative values of the Gulf? Environmental values, fishing values, beach. I was reading in the paper today, beach resorts are suffering, even though there's not a whole lot of oil. In fact, they're having trouble finding it now. I don't know if you noticed that in the news. Having trouble locating the oil. Where did it go? We don't know. Maybe the bacteria ate it. But this is, anyway, apart from where the oil went, the bureaucrats don't have much of an incentive to care about volleyball tournaments in Biloxi, Mississippi, which have been canceled because of fear of the oil washing up on the beach. They don't have an incentive to care about shrimpers' rights or fishing rights or recreational purposes, exploiting any other kinds of mineral deposits that might be there, or simply maintaining some sort of pristine ocean environment in which people might like to go out and enjoy the water. When they're awarding the exploration rights, they're awarding them to the highest bidder without considering the opportunity cost. So Shugart says, these leases are auctioned willy-nilly, frequently ignoring safety concerns in the process in order to maximize governmental revenue rather than to ensure that the natural resources on the outer continental shelf are allocated efficiently. Another thing that's gotten some attention, you might have heard this already, is that the federal government capped liability at $75 million for spills. This is after the Exxon Valdez spill in Alaska. Now, they can waive this limit in cases where there's proven gross negligence, and that will probably be the case here. But BP might have been a little more cautious from the beginning if they knew that there's no such cap at all. There's no limit to their liability at $75 million, which is a drop in the bucket for a company that's making a profit of $14 billion last year. You assign liability for torts that you might commit against someone else, and you might actually think about putting an additional safety device or making sure that the safety procedures are followed, that kind of thing. But if you don't have an incentive to do so because the government's removed that incentive in a variety of ways, we're going to have an increased likelihood of these kinds of events. Now, I'm just about out of time. I won't say much else, but and I will say there's lots more that you can read and study on environmental issues. I would say markets are very consistent with preserving environmental purity and preserving environmental use for valuable purposes. We don't have to see some sort of disconnect between in preserving the environment and allowing individual liberty and human freedom. I think those ideals that we hold dear of liberty and freedom and property are very consistent with having an environment that is more along the lines of what we'd like to see. I can meet with you afterwards. I'm going to clear this space for the next speaker, but if you want, I will be right out here in the neighboring room, and if there's something that I did not get to in my talk here, then you're welcome to hear me say, I don't know, out there rather than up here. So thank you for your attention.